Biden got so concerned after reading what the CIA delivered him. He's so worried about what's about to happen to Ukraine that Joe Biden called the president of Ukraine to warn him about his fate. And then someone in the intel community leaked the transcript of that call to CNN, not for the first time. Here it is.
We have breaking news for you in our world lead. A senior Ukrainian official tells CNN that today's phone call between President Biden and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, quote, did not go well. Our source tells CNN that the two disagreed about the immediacy of the threat of a Russian attack on Ukraine. The White House and Pentagon have been emphatic that they believe an attack could be imminent. We should note the White House just released its own readout of that call, and there was no mention of President Biden's warnings or the two presidents' disagreements.
Listen to this from CNN's Natasha Bertrand. She did this reporting, quote, per a senior Ukrainian official, Biden told President Zelensky that a Russian invasion of Ukraine is now virtually certain and that Kiev could be sacked. Prepare for impact, Biden reportedly said. President Zelensky disagreed, and as I reported, asked him to tone down the rhetoric. What? Joe Biden is more worried about Russia than the president of Ukraine is? It looks that way, because not long after that reporting, CNN's Natasha Bertrand deleted that tweet. Oh, and then an hour later, CNN's Jim Sciutto contradicted CNN's own previous reporting. He tweeted out this White House statement, which at CNN qualifies as reporting, a statement from the White House. Here's what it said. White House on Biden-Zelensky call. Anonymous sources are leaking falsehoods. The only person who should be sacked is the anonymous source who is circulating an inaccurate portrayal of this conversation. End quote. Not an actual denial, therefore it's true. It's an amazing sequence, really, if you think about it. So Biden tells the Ukrainian president that his capital city is about to be sacked, like Rome in the 5th century. Blood and screams, fire, spears and swords, sieges and trebuchets. A horrible scene. And Ukrainians lead a response to this? Calm down, dude. You're freaking me out. Toughen up. You sound like a terrified old woman. Now, the White House claims that conversation never happened, but clearly it did happen because at a press conference today, President Zelensky said virtually the same thing to the media.
We've talked to the president. We've talked about this. We think that there has to be a balanced approach. I'm not saying that he's influencing American media. They're independent, but the media policy there has to be well balanced. If they want to know what the situation is, that they can come to Kyiv. Do we have tanks on the street? No. The image that mass media creates is that we have troops on the roads, we have mobilization, people are leaving for places. That's not the case. We don't need this panic.
Have you decided how soon you would be moving U.S. troops to Eastern Europe?
I'll be moving U.S. troops to Eastern Europe and the NATO countries in the near term.
Lieutenant Colonel in the Marine Corps, who famously left service for telling the truth very recently. We're happy to have him. Mr. Scheller, thank you for coming on.
Thanks, Tucker. Thanks for having me on.
So, as someone who did multiple combat deployments in a number of different countries, you were sort of on the fighting end of Max Boot's plans. I wonder if it's surprising to you that almost nobody calling for involvement in this conflict has thought through the consequences of it.
That's a good question, Tucker. I thought you hit the nail on the head when you said NATO hasn't even stood up the force yet. General Milley and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin didn't even address that when they talked about the 8,500 troops that they're mobilizing. They did say that they would be part of a NATO force that, again, hasn't been stood up. So, quite honestly, I'm confused really what we're talking about at this point.
Right. So NATO, I mean, I have never figured out what NATO's job exactly is, but in rough terms, it's to keep Russia under control, I guess. And if this is an example of Russia out of control, you'd think they'd be the first to the fight, but they're not. So what does that mean exactly?
Correct. NATO was stood up after World War II to prevent Russian aggression, but since 1990, when the Soviet Union fell, and in 91, when countries like Ukraine were created, right, we had a advance of NATO countries. So Poland, Romania, these countries on Ukraine's border are actual NATO members. Ukraine is not a NATO member. They are a NATO partner. And it's getting confusing because when you hear the general speak, they talk about NATO allies, but they don't differentiate between a member and a partner. And Ukraine is not a NATO member. Hence, right, NATO has not stood up the force yet. So right now, America is getting spun up. And I quite honestly don't understand the logic or the end game, which is why I asked to come and talk to your audience.
Well, it's so interesting to hear from you specifically because you had to leave a job you loved after 17 years, I think, as a Marine Corps officer, because you asked the question, is anybody learning anything from the disaster of our Afghanistan withdrawal, a country that you served in extensively? And I'm wondering, shouldn't we pause, learn maybe some lessons from that sad chapter before we progress on to the next conflict?
100%. The same people that advised the Afghanistan withdrawal are advising right now, and we absolutely need to take a hard look at what we're trying to accomplish. We need to signal very clearly what our intentions are. The reason we went to Desert Shield and Desert Storm is because we didn't clearly signal to Saddam Hussein that had he invaded Kuwait that we would respond with military force. And the same thing is happening right now. We're mobilizing 8,500 troops without the NATO force even being stood up. No one really clearly understands what we're trying to accomplish. And I think that if Russia was to invade, because we can't even come to a clear understanding on what's happening, because I don't think the generals have a clear plan or are advising correctly, we could end up in a much worse position than we are now.
It feels that way. You just made reference to the troops being mobilized to Eastern Europe. I'd love to get clarity on what Eastern Europe means. But we have a clip of Joe Biden saying that just a short time ago. Here it is.
Have you decided how soon you would be moving U.S. troops to Eastern Europe?
I'll be moving U.S. troops to Eastern Europe and the NATO countries in the near term.
Again, without getting into all the technical aspects of NATO and what it's authorized to do or not do, it seems like, what's the point of NATO if we have to move American troops unilaterally to, quote, Eastern Europe?
Correct. I've read the Russians' national security strategy, and the greatest threat facing Russia, according to them, from their perspective, is NATO. Hence, whenever a border country tries to seek membership, they try to destabilize it. And so the very thing that NATO is there to prevent is actually exacerbating the problem. We need to take a hard look at what NATO is supposed to do. And the other thing is the amount of money that the United States throws at NATO has actually crippled our European partners that should be leading this fight. Our European partners that should be standing up the NATO force that are not. Currently, the United States is really the only one beating to the drum, to the point you already made, where the Ukrainian president is saying, calm down. We seem to be stirring this up ourselves without really fully understanding the bigger picture.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's been 80 years. I think we can trust Western Europe with guns now. And I'm just very sad that you left the officer corps, because obviously this country needs you in a position of authority, and I hope you find another. Stu Scheller, thank you.
Tucker Carlson saying that the U.S. should be siding with Russia over Ukraine. What, you may say?
Members of Congress are actually getting phone calls encouraging them to side with Russia because they're watching right-wing media and people like Tucker Carlson.
It is striking how neatly Kremlin propaganda seems to dovetail with Carlson's talking points.
When Tucker Carlson delivers this message, it's dangerous.
Now, Tucker seems to have some sort of larger pattern here with tyrants who lean to the right.
But why is he so committed, and why is Fox News, on his behalf, so committed to tearing down American embrace and support and alignment with the world's democracies?
Tucker is utterly shameless. If he had any capacity to feel any shame, he should be embarrassed by what he just said, because he is basically repeating rank Russian propaganda.
Mr. Max Boot, ladies and gentlemen, in his final domestic television appearance before he heads to Ukraine to defend that nation himself, its territorial integrity from the aggression of Vladimir Putin. Watch him while you can. But let's be clear about what the terms are. In the United States, and this does not apply to Ukraine, where they have probably a more sane view of it, or maybe just more Russian influence view of it, but in the United States, if you raise any questions about the wisdom of siding in a war in Eastern Europe with one country over another, you are, by definition, an agent of the single greatest threat to democracy on this globe, Mr. Vladimir Putin himself. You're treasonous. Congressman Tom Malinowski of New Jersey is claiming that viewers of this show, Russian Robots to a Man, reached out to his office and did something horrifying, something that probably should be illegal. They said maybe we shouldn't go to war over Ukraine.
Can you just tell us about these phone calls that your office is getting?
Yeah, sure. It really started yesterday. I was in my district office in New Jersey, and phones were ringing, and my district director came to me and said, I just spent an hour on the phone with like 4 people telling me that they'd watched Tucker Carlson last night, and why are we going to be going to war for Ukraine? Russia's making reasonable proposals for peace, and we should just do what Russia wants.
Yeah. Now, a lot of people have said Tom Malinowski, is not the sharpest knife in the drawer, right? Even by the standards of New Jersey. However, he makes a really good point. There are people out there who look around and decide, maybe, I don't know, homelessness, close to 1 million people living on the street in the United States, 100,000 Americans dying of drug ODs, inflation, the fact our schools haven't taught anything in over 2 years, maybe these are more important concerns than the territorial integrity of a country we can't find on a map. Maybe our own territorial integrity is more important than Ukraine's. And the question, as Congressman Malinowski raises, is why would they ever think that? Where would they get the idea that their stupid parochial domestic concerns are more important than Ukraine's eastern border? And the answer, of course, is Vladimir Putin. They've obviously fallen for the Russian propaganda. That would be us, doing Vladimir Putin's bidding. Like the president of Ukraine, we're guilty. Well, for some perspective tonight, clearly we've lost it since we're working for Russia. We are joined tonight by Stu Scheller. He's a longtime lieutenant colonel.